My name is Angelina Stancampiano. I was the Senior Naturalist Coordinator for Oklahoma State Parks, and I'm now the Shoshone District Interpretive Ranger for Wyoming State Parks. In fall of 2020, I was sent a grant opportunity from the National Environmental Education Foundation with this COVID Recovery Fund. So the aim was these groups that had been negatively impacted by COVID in a way that the visitation increased, volunteers decreased, staffing decreased, but we were seeing more people than ever in parks. How can we combat that? How can we create a safe way for all of these extra people to be visiting parks? And how can we do it in the most accessible way possible? So I was sent this opportunity by a colleague. And the more I read into it, the more I realized it was exactly for my park. A park with 16 miles of trails and only a quarter mile of accessible trails. For a long time I had thought needed to be transformed, and I just didn't know how. It was the least visited, the least beautiful. So if you're going to just have one trail in your park that's accessible, it needs to be the best. It needs to be the prettiest. It needs to be the highlight of the park. And so I started planning on how I could make it magical for everyone. And I wanted to make it accessible, but also equitable in a way that it wasn't something you took someone just because it was the only trail they could access. I wanted that to be the premier trail within the park that everyone, regardless of capability, would equally want to visit. And I thought, what better way than a fairy forest? How to make it fantastical. And we did that with a $2,000 grant and a lot of volunteers. We transformed a dilapidated old water tower building into a magical mural that everyone wanted to come and have their picture taken at. That quarter-mile trail, which used to take 5 minutes to walk through, all of a sudden could take an hour because there were so many places to look and sounds to hear, the smells and the way the light was moving. It made you want to go at a slower pace. It happened in the spring of 2021, which to me is the most magical time of year. The smells of plants and birds chirping and invertebrates like the butterflies and the dragonflies coming out in the warm weather. And it's just naturally a magical time of year in nature. It created the perfect backdrop for the experience. So we've been in pandemic for a year. People haven't been seeing their family, their friends, and this was something to go and do, something safe and outdoors, something for people of all skill level for the first time in a year, and feel like they were all doing something together that was special in a way that it was magical, but not special in a way that it felt like it was part of that COVID bubble. As a biologist, I wanted every piece of it to be local flora and fauna. Even though fairies and dragons and unicorns are fantastical, I think that Luna moths and ruby-throated hummingbirds are just as whimsical, just as fantastical. So in all of our signage, we used native flora and fauna to be depicted, and even mushrooms. So flora and fauna, from ferns and fungi to frogs and fawns. So these things that we have here in Oklahoma that people might not even realize, like ferns and these crazy mushrooms that spore to reproduce. And the signs all reflected that. So the beautiful art was done by an Oklahoma artist and depicting these Oklahoma flora and fauna. And the rhyming poems were detailing these native species and teaching you something without you realizing that me, the biologist, was trying to teach you something. We applied for this grant at the beginning of December. We were awarded it in March, and the project was released April 22nd. So it was a really quick turnaround. But that allowed for so many people to be involved with it, which really added a lot of magic. So it wasn't just through my eyes, it was Girl Scouts and volunteers who sent in garlands they made, volunteers who came on site and helped assemble arches, volunteers who came and painted murals. There were all kinds of people that lent their artistic ability to make this possible. In addition to the trail itself being accessible, I wanted every part of the experience to be accessible. And a lot of times we get stuck on that word, or we think, who are we to be the expert? Who are we to make something accessible? And I found this quote from Voltaire that says, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." So I just started where everyone else does. I did a Google search on how to make things as accessible as possible. And rather than finding a lot of sources to help me, I found a lack of sources. And so I thought, if no one else is doing this, no one else has anything to go off of. So how can I create something that we can all learn from? It's not going to be perfect, but how do we start? So I wanted this experience to be accessible for those in wheelchairs, which I think is what we initially think of when we think of accessibility. But I've also had people attend programming that are on the spectrum, and maybe bright colors or PowerPoints or the noises or the live animals are too much for their sensory issues. I also wanted it to be accessible to those with vision impairments. So not only those that are legally blind, but perhaps older folks who are losing vision, or even young children who are learning to read and need text to be really clear. So we chose fonts that were very legible and had them printed very large. And I wrote rhyming poems, 4 lines on a 4th grade reading level. So something that no matter the visitor who is there, they could understand what these signs were saying. They all also had QR codes. So those with visual impairments could scan the QR code and have the text read for them, allowing all types of people to be able to come through the exhibit. It was also in a small town, a really poor rural area that never has a special exhibit come. So people in Cherokee County were able to access something special right there in their community. Perhaps they have limited transportation. Perhaps they don't go on a summer vacation and going to the local state park is that event of the year for them. So I wanted to bring something to that community, not a big city, not a special place, not with an admission, but something that all people could attend. That initial colleague who sent me this grant opportunity and sparked everything, when I told her my idea, she said, okay, let me assemble a crew, and collected additional funding and assembled a group of people to come to the park on a Sunday on their own time and put in a 1/4 mile long guided braille trail. So posts every 10 feet for the entire 1/4 mile, digging with an auger, putting in the rebar and stringing rope. And they made it possible for a month turnaround time from the time that this concept all came together, the grant was awarded, and everything went into place. So it was really so much community outreach allowing this to happen. And it was in the time of COVID where some people didn't feel safe even coming to volunteer outdoors. I had a visitor contact me via email and say that she wanted to help from afar. So she strung several 100 feet of garland that was able to be outdoors, and she mailed it to me in a box. So we were able to hang that up and have her help, even though she never stepped foot on site. With creating this project, I also, as a biologist, have in the forefront of my mind not creating more trash. How do I put something together that's not creating microtrash or using resources that are costing energy that are never going to be used again? So I created a sustainable project, solar and wind powered. Nothing took batteries, nothing needed to be plugged in. It was all powered by our natural Oklahoma sun and wind. We had windmills, we had sun catchers, wind chimes. We had all kinds of things that were naturally powered by the environment to create this magical place. All of the signs were put on pallets so that they could be moved from site to site and not just stay in place there. I had old sheets that I tore into strips and dyed that we used to make all of the garlands rather than buying fabric fresh. We used driftwood and wood from the burn pile to create miniature fairy homes. We used satellite dishes and spools to create really easy to move and sustainable fairy creations, because all of our miniatures were glued to the satellite dishes. So the whole thing could be picked up and moved from place to place, but wasn't blown away in the Oklahoma wind. The exhibit was at Sequoia State Park for 6 weeks. My thought was something special, something fleeting would be an exhibit. Not there permanently, but there for a short time that you had to come and experience in that window. And it was accessible day and night. I wanted people to be able to go anytime when it was best for them. So perhaps it was an older person who was better in the mornings, or maybe someone who had sensory issues and was better after a nap midday. And as part of that, I made it full of solar lights. So if you went during the day, it was a completely different experience than when you were going at night and experiencing the forest lit up with really easy, color-changing, soft lights. Never bright flashes or loud noises. We had local nursing home residents come and visit, as well as those in special needs homes. It was something that the whole group could do together at their own pace. And if there were a lot of people there, they could come back another time because it was accessible 24/7. And then after it was at Sequoia State Park, the whole sustainable project could be picked up and moved. We moved it to Woodward, Oklahoma, to Boiling Springs State Park, another small community in a very rural area and low income. So something special to serve that community. And because all of the pieces were already made and everything purchased, they could be picked up and moved, and it looked like a completely different exhibit, even though it was all of the same pieces at a different park. Things weren't perfect, but things were really good. And I learned a lot. And in me learning a lot, I was able to showcase something for so many other people to go through and learn from. And now we can replicate it anywhere. And it's a project that I don't want to be kept a secret, that I want to share every part of with other programmers wherever they are, to be able to make a sustainable and an accessible exhibit for their own communities, no matter how small, no matter how underserved, no matter how poor, no matter the color, no matter any of those aspects that we typically have to think about in our programming. I want this to just be a blueprint for them to all use to make something just as magical.